6:34. We're in room, I thought we were in room 1112, or is it correct? We are in room 1112 at 1 Judiciary Square, and we will begin. Welcome to all of our friends who are watching online. I'm Gregory McCarthy. Why don't we go around the table and say who's here?
Yep, Eric Williams, Dorothy Brown, Georgetown Law.
Len Lee, District Chief Financial Officer.
David Catania, member of the commission.
Mike Hageman, Research Associate with the Tax Revision Commission.
Jacob Sayan, member of the commission.
Nick Johnson, Director of Tax Revision Commission.
Excellent. Okay, tonight's agenda is a full one. We're looking forward to it. We're going to hear from our research director, Nick, about what he's been doing and the work underway there. He keeps the trains running on time. Thank you very much. And we're going to have two distinguished speakers. And the topic tonight is taxation policy and questions of racial equity. Dr. Dorothy Brown from Georgetown University Law Center with us, and Nami Modi from the Council Office of Racial Equity. We'll have your presentations and then questions to you from the commission members. And then we're going to try thereafter to have the commission members kind of channel their observations and thoughts about the discussions tonight into what the implications would be for our possible recommendations next year. And Nick and Mike will dutifully take those notes down and make them into something really pretty to consider later on. So Nick, why don't you get started and tell us what's been going on?
Great, thanks. I wanted to share what all of you have in front of you, a binder, and the materials in the binder either are already on the website or will be on the website. But I wanted to walk you all through it. The idea here is that we will, going forward at meetings, we will be providing you additional materials that you can put in yourself, as well as an updated table of contents. A couple of things to draw your attention to right now that is relevant to what's going on. If you flip to the first couple of items in here are things you've already seen, but if you flip to the page right before the clear tab, it's the schedule of planned expert briefings, and it's got a note on it saying draft subject to revision. And to make good on that promise of revision, I've already messed around with it a little bit. You'll see that next week's planned discussion we were going to focus on the work of the 2013 DC Tax Revision Commission, but due to scheduling issues, we can't do that next week. So we are going to postpone that into the new year. It could be a really good conversation. Early in January, our Chief Financial Officer will give a presentation about some of the initiatives they're preparing in the area of tax administration. In mid-January, I want to do a session. I think we need to do a session on tax policy for equity and economic opportunity. One of the sessions that Erica and Yeshim had sketched out. That date is not going to work for the folks we had in mind. So I'm going to suggest, if you all don't mind going away and looking at your calendars, I'm going to suggest January 19th, maybe a possibility. Don't cancel all of your fancy dinner dates for that night. I'm not sure yet, but let me know if January 19th is a problem. And then you can review everything else is pretty much a work in progress. But I wanted you to have a little bit of a sketch of what things are looking like. I think it's more likely that we will add to this list than anything else, but I know we don't cover everything here. The next thing I want to draw to your attention is if you then flip over the binder, you will see we've got four. Mike and I, with a big assist from Becky, have started working on a series of background documents on various aspects of DC tax policy. So far, we've done an overview of the tax changes since the 2013 commission. We've got a high level piece on the income tax, on the sales tax, and on excise taxes. That one's on property taxes and corporate taxes on the way. And the last page in that section is a list of what we have ahead. These are not deep dive analyses of tax policy. These are really sort of just the facts, just the basic data and information perspective. I think hopefully we'll get us all on the same page. If you have, it's a very much a work in progress. So if there's additional background that you think would be useful, if you read it and be like, yeah, this is a great format, I'd love to see it on X. feel free to let us know, put it in for David.
I'm sorry, just a quick question. Are our meetings recorded for purposes of, for instance, January 3rd, I may not be able to make it. And I'd like to see what the CFO has to say, and I want to just make sure that the meetings are recorded and that I can download it at additional at a later time. Is that good?
Absolutely. Yep. We are, in fact, we're on a new platform today. We're using WebEx, which I think is going to be a better platform for us.
If I have questions, I can ask him about where to find it.
Dave,
Yeah.
Mike has become our, yeah, but all the links to all the recordings are on the website. And actually, it's true for the past meetings too.
Thank you.
And then the last thing I'll draw your attention to, if you've, between the blue and orange tabs is all the materials that have been handed out for the past meetings, and as well as the background reading for this meeting. And then at the very end, between the orange and yellow tabs, is a list that I think you might find interesting and helpful. It's a running list of ideas, for lack of a better word, policy options, writ large. Nothing here, obviously, is something we are committed to doing necessarily any more work on or digging into. We're not, it doesn't represent a commitment to anything. We just wanted to start a running list of ideas that have come up and wanted to make sure that that's visible to all of you. And as things come up, as we mention things during the course of this meeting and future meetings, we will add them to this list. And the idea is that as we get into April, May, and we start fleshing out policy options for discussion, we will be drawing on this list. That's the idea.
Questions? Do we leave this here every night? Or-
I would love it if you would bring it home and bring it back, or you don't have to bring it back, but you will get additional
Good.
inserts that you can then either have fun putting in the binder.
You can keep it by your bed if you have trouble falling asleep.
Absolutely.
That's what
excellent.
pharmaceuticals are for, great.
When you go on your tropical vacations, bring it along.
Great. Rashawn, would you like to introduce yourself for the
I
record?
was just wondering if I don't get extra credit for creating my own body.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, that's okay.
You absolutely do.
You know, overachiever. I am Rashawn Bernard, president of Building Bridges Across the River. Great being with you.
Okay, I think now we'll segue into the exciting part of the night, hearing from our two speakers. The first speaker up is Professor Dorothy Brown, who holds the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair at Georgetown University Law School. In this town, we use the words nationally renowned and great expert a lot, but in terms of tax policy, especially as it relates to social equity, I do think we have the best person in the country here tonight. So thank you for being here. Professor Brown has taught at Emory, Washington and Lee University, the University of Cincinnati, and George Mason University, has written countless articles, numerous books. You told me about one you've got going right now. So we're really honored that you're here tonight. We'd like to ask you to speak for about 25 minutes, if that's okay. And then we'll hear from Nami Modi after that, and then we'll have a group discussion thereafter.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank the commission chair and vice chair, along with all the members, for allowing me to speak to you this evening. And I'm speaking in my individual capacity as a law professor at Georgetown, and my remarks only reflect my opinions. I went into tax law to get away from race. Growing up in the South Bronx and experiencing racism regularly made me want to practice a type of tax law that had nothing to do with race. And I thought that I would find it in tax law. I majored in accounting in college, took tax classes in law school, and after graduating law school, received a master's degree in tax law. Never once was race ever mentioned in any of my classes. That seemed about right to me, given that the Internal Revenue Code says nothing about race. In my view, the only color that mattered was green. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. How I came to the realization that race and tax law were inextricably linked was a journey that began at my parents' kitchen table, where every spring I would prepare their tax returns. My mother was a nurse, my father was a plumber, their tax returns were straightforward, yet I was always struck by the feeling that my parents paid too much in taxes. I knew that I had not missed anything, but my gut told me something was wrong. I would never have figured it out had I not become a law professor. One day in the early 1990s, while on the faculty at George Mason, now Antonin Scalia Law School, I had time to read an article by a respected mentor that asked the following question: To what extent have our tax laws been distorted by racism? In that moment, I started to question everything I thought I knew about tax law. I decided that I would try to answer the question, and the first roadblock that I hit was a lack of race and tax data. Neither the IRS nor the Treasury Department publishes statistics by race. That makes them outliers when compared with other government agencies. And although President Biden signed a racial equity order that requires federal agencies to disaggregate data by race, almost 2 years later, we still have no data. But I am hearing information that suggests this might change soon. As a result of the choices made by Treasury and IRS, I began looking at economic disparity statistics by race and applying my tax knowledge because I was determined to answer the question raised by my mentor. What I discovered was that when white and Black Americans engage in the same behavior, like buying a home, getting a job, or building wealth, tax law subsidizes white taxpayers while disadvantaging Black taxpayers. Let's start with homeownership and the important role of history. The majority of white Americans are homeowners, while the majority of Black Americans are renters. Those current statistics are born out of a racially discriminatory past where between 1940 and 1950, when a majority of white Americans became homeowners due to the Department of Housing and Urban Development subsidies that Black Americans were generally excluded from. Today, the overall rate of homeownership is 65%. By race and ethnicity, it's as follows: 74% for white Americans, almost 60% for Asian Americans, 55% for American Indian or Alaskan Native, 48% for Hispanic Americans, and 44% for Black Americans. As a result, all tax subsidies from homeownership will not benefit Black and Hispanic Americans the least, as the majority of those groups are renters and not homeowners, and we provide no tax subsidies for rent. Homeownership has been historically and remains an asset tied to racial identity. The tax subsidy for homeownership that I want to focus on, however, is the rule that excludes gain when homes are sold. Gains on sales of homes can escape taxation for up to $500,000 if the taxpayer is married, or $250,000 if the taxpayer is single. Losses on the sale of homes, on the other hand, are not deductible. And the special tax treatment for gains date back to 1951. By 1950, 55% of white Americans had become homeowners. Just a decade earlier, only 44% of white Americans were homeowners. That explosive white homeownership growth was aided by low-cost, long-term fixed interest rate mortgages insured by the federal government that largely excluded Black Americans. From its origins, the tax break for gain on home sales was designed to benefit white homeowners. Established research shows us that the greatest appreciation in our homes comes when we live in neighborhoods which are overwhelmingly white with very few Black neighbors. As the percentage of Black homeowners in the neighborhood increases, the value of the homes decrease, particularly because white homebuyer preferences, as the majority of home buyers, help establish the market prices. While most white homeowners live in neighborhoods with very few Black neighbors, the majority of Black homeowners live in racially diverse or all Black neighborhoods with many Black neighbors. As a result, white homeowners, but not most Black homeowners, are more likely to sell at a large tax-free gain. Research also shows that the homeowners most likely to sell their homes at a non-deductible loss are Black. Tax subsidies for homeownership, therefore, create white tax winners and Black tax losers. The next area I want to highlight are tax subsidies for work, specifically employer-provided retirement accounts. Retirement accounts as a tax benefit traces its roots to 1942, when price and wage controls, along with an excess profits tax, encouraged employers to provide non-wage benefits like retirement accounts. Amounts set aside in retirement accounts by employees, and if there's an employer match, amounts set aside by their employer, are not taxable to the employee until their expected withdrawal at retirement. If any amounts are withdrawn prior to the age of 59 and a half, they are subject to an additional tax penalty. Black Americans are less likely than white Americans to work for employers that provide retirement accounts. In the private sector, for workers aged between 21 and 64, 56% of white workers work for an employer that offers a retirement account, compared with 50% of Black workers and almost 35% of Hispanic workers. But just having access isn't enough. Almost 46% of white workers, almost 37% of Black workers, and only a quarter of Hispanic workers actually participate in their private sector employer-provided retirement accounts. Research also suggests that Black workers are more likely than all other racial and ethnic groups to take an early withdrawal regardless of income and pay a tax penalty. One potential explanation could come from research that shows Black college graduates are more likely to send money home to their parents and other family members in financial distress, while white college graduates are more likely to receive money from their parents and other family members that enable them to be able to save more and build wealth. Black college graduates have to make their dollars stretch farther than their white peers, which make it less likely for them to be able to contribute to their retirement accounts and more likely to withdraw what they may have been able to contribute. Finally, I look at wealth building tax provisions, the preferential rate for capital gains, and the exclusion for gifts and inheritances. At the beginning of our modern progressive income tax system, the only people who paid taxes were the richest Americans. In 1916, that meant only 1% of Americans filed a tax return. Among that 1% was Frederick Brewster. The Brewsters were the second wealthiest family in America, behind the Rockefellers. In 1916, Frederick sold bonds at a $2 million profit in today's dollars and didn't want to pay taxes on the profit. He argued that he didn't owe any taxes because he wasn't a dealer, but only sold occasionally as an investor. The IRS said he owed an additional $400,000 in taxes. Frederick sued and took it all the way to the Supreme Court, where he lost. And while he lost at the Supreme Court, he won at Congress, because that very same year, Congress enacted a lower tax rate for capital gains, providing a major victory for the wealthy 1%ers. So within a few years of our progressive income tax system designed for the richest Americans to pay their fair share, we now have a huge loophole for the wealthy because they went out and got it. We know today that the richest Americans receive the lion's share of the benefits from the low tax rate on capital gains. Not even wealthy Black and Hispanic Americans benefit from this loophole to the extent that their wealthy white peers do. Gifts and inheritance, on the other hand, were excluded from the beginning of our modern income tax system. The median household wealth of a white high school dropout is greater than the median wealth of a Black college graduate. Part of the explanation lies in family financial transfers. Research shows that gifts and inheritances help to explain the racial wealth gap. A study followed families over a 25-year period and showed that white Americans were 5 times more likely to inherit than Black Americans. Among Black and white Americans who actually received an inheritance, white Americans received about 10 times more wealth than Black Americans. For each dollar inherited, white families were able to use 91% to increase their wealth, compared with only 20% used to increase Black wealth. One explanation is that Black Americans had extended family members who were alive during Jim Crow and received fewer opportunities to build wealth because of government racial discrimination that required the additional support by higher income family members. Black college graduates are more likely to send money to their parents, depleting their wealth, while white college graduates were more likely to receive money from their parents, enabling them to build wealth. Once again, tax policy exacerbates the racial wealth gap. Gifts and inheritances are received tax-free. Financial transfers by Black Americans to help support family members are not tax deductible. Those without wealth do not have tax breaks to help them build wealth. I believe tax-free family financial transfers help explain why white households with a high school dropout have more wealth than that found in the households of Black college graduates. Well, there is no single tax policy change that can eliminate the racial wealth gap. I propose a tax credit that can help reduce the racial wealth gap. As explained in more detail in Chapter 6 of my book, The Whiteness of Wealth, I advocate for a wealth tax credit for all taxpayers in households with below median wealth of roughly $100,000. If your tax liability is lower than the credit, the taxpayer would receive the difference in the form of a refund every year. If your tax liability is higher, the taxpayer would pay the difference. But that taxpayer would still pay less than those with the same income, but with above median wealth. It would disproportionately benefit Black taxpayers because 83% of Black households have wealth below the white median wealth levels. But it would also benefit taxpayers regardless of race and/or ethnicity with below median wealth. This proposal seeks to directly help Americans with the least wealth. The refundable wealth tax credit is different from the earned income tax credit in that it is measured by household wealth, whereas the earned income tax credit is a function of income. In addition, while the earned income tax credit is extremely complicated and results in significant errors, not to mention recent ProPublica reports that the IRS is targeting Black and brown EITC plaintiffs for audits, a wealth tax credit would be quite straightforward to implement. It could be a fixed amount that each taxpayer is eligible to receive, eliminating any possible confusion as to the amount of the credit claimed. The taxpayer lives in a household with below median wealth, the taxpayer is eligible for the refundable wealth tax credit. It could be a tax credit that ends after a term of years or after the wealth gap decreases or continues in perpetuity. The idea of a refundable wealth tax credit is the important point, and the actual details should allow for flexibility in order to obtain political support. A refundable wealth-based credit will not exclusively help the Black taxpayers who suffered under Jim Crow while paying first-class taxes or continue to pay higher taxes today because they are Black, but a refundable wealth tax credit will disproportionately go to Black taxpayers and withstand any charges of unconstitutional race-based policy. A refundable wealth tax credit could help low wealth family members that are currently being supported by higher income relatives, which is relatively common among Black families. Whether we are talking about federal income taxes, property taxes, consumption taxes, or who pays fines and fees in Ferguson, Missouri, the answer is the same. Black and brown Americans are more likely to pay higher taxes than their white peers, even though the statutes involved are race neutral. Federal income taxes are not the only taxes that have a racially disparate impact. Research shows property taxes do as well. And I want to start with research in Professor Andrew Carl's article, The Power to Destroy Discriminatory Property Assessments and the Struggle for Tax Justice in Mississippi. In August 1966, Black citizens in Edwards, Mississippi launched a boycott of white-owned businesses in town because the Black sections of town lacked paved streets, sidewalks, streetlights, garbage service, and adequate sewage and drainage facilities. Town officials treated Black citizens with contempt. The mayor, for example, kept a sign that read, "We'd rather fight than change," prominently displayed in his office window, and he made a point of being unavailable to meet with Black citizens groups. The woman who collected water bills was fond of cutting off service to Black customers for the slightest delay in payment, which was often since she failed to maintain normal office hours. Garbage collectors provided curbside service only to white residents, while the town's maintenance crew neglected the town's Black cemetery. Area employers only hired Black residents for the lowest paying, most menial positions. To make matters worse, the town had recently approved the location of a chemical plant adjacent to the Black section of town. Accidents at the plant had resulted in the admission of toxic fumes into Black homes. The boycott by the Black citizens resulted in decreased consumer spending by over 60% of the town's 1,200 residents. The boycott threatened to not only cripple local white businesses, but also decimate the town's finances, which were heavily dependent on the sales taxes. In addition to boycotting businesses, nearly all Black maids who worked in white homes walked off the job. By the end of the summer, only 1 in 5 had returned to work. As the boycott began, white officials retaliated. The mayor imposed a 7 p.m. curfew on all businesses, which was designed to prevent African Americans who worked late from shopping at Black businesses. But that didn't work. Boycotters stepped in and launched a shuttle service to a grocery store in nearby towns. They also appealed the curfew in federal district court where it was invalidated in September 1966. Highly organized, disciplined, and determined to enact change, the boycotters pushed many merchants to the to the brink of bankruptcy. Quietly, merchants pleaded with town officials to broker a compromise. Publicly, they took out their frustrations on their former customers. Violent assaults on protesters became common. On August 11th, a white merchant assaulted a black man picketing the store, yet the black man was arrested for assault and battery. In mid-September, African Americans organized a run on the bank, withdrawing $2,000 from savings and checking accounts. In October, the boycott remained almost 100% effective. The local furniture store was doing absolutely no business. The gas station was losing $100 a week. The theater had been forced to close, and the laundromat's weekly revenues had dropped to $15 from the usual $200. In statewide elections on November 8, 1966, Black Americans in Edwards demonstrated their new voting power. Reporting on the vote tallies, it was said that, quote, "It is now evident that the Negroes can outvote the white people by quite a majority in any city election in Edwards," close quote. Shortly thereafter, town officials formally agreed to pave streets, add sewer lines in Black neighborhoods, and to raise the hourly wage of garbage workers to $1.25 an hour in exchange for an end to the boycott. I know you're thinking, where's the tax angle? But it's coming. Among the many threats whites leveled at the boycotters, one related to tax. One summer day in the middle of the boycott, town alderman Sam Tupper approached two leaders of the boycott and warned, quote, "You are all going to pay for the boycott. Your taxes are going to be doubled," close quote. And indeed, in October 1966, as the boycott continued, Mayor Clark Robbins, Town Assessor Ruth Harrell, and the Board of Aldermen met to revise the land assessment rolls for the year. Rather than copy the previous year's rolls as had been done in years past, Harrell combed through the rolls and selectively raised assessments on Black participants in the boycott. The degree of adjustment roughly correlated with the homeowner's level of participation or leadership in the boycotts and protests. In the end, white town officials raised assessments on 237 lots owned by African Americans. Overall, Black property owners saw the assessed value of their holdings increase by $131,800 over the previous year, a 52.6% jump. By contrast, town officials raised assessments on only 34 white-owned lots. And in each of these cases, improvements had been made to the property in the past year. Sam Tupper, the alderman who had threatened protesters with higher taxes, decreased the assessment on his home from $2,500 to $1,000. By contrast, those Black homeowners who did not receive higher assessments were, without exception, those who either opposed the boycott, violated the boycott, and were known to confide to white Americans about what was going on with the boycott. The Black residents ultimately sued over their high property tax bills and lost. It was upheld by the Fifth Circuit, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Why? The court's analysis was that because they had a remedy in Mississippi's appeal process, they had no right to sue in federal court. The district court judge concluded that the plaintiffs had failed to present, quote, "any evidence which impugned the honesty or integrity or fairness of any member of the Board of Aldermen or the mayor," close quote. 21st century research has shown property tax bills nationwide are higher for Black homeowners than white homeowners. As reported in the Washington Post on July 2020, quote, "State by state, neighborhood by neighborhood, Black families pay 13% more in property taxes each year than a white family would in the same situation. Black-owned homes are consistently assessed at higher values relative to their actual sale price than white homes, according to a new working paper by economist Drew Howard of the University of Utah and Carlos Abenancio Leon of Indiana University," close quote. Sales taxes have also been proven to have a racially disparate impact. According to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, consumption taxes, most notably general sales taxes, are the most regressive type of taxes relied on by state and local governments, and the most significant drivers of racial inequity in state and local tax codes. Low and middle income families pay a larger share of their incomes in consumption taxes than the rich. While most low income taxpayers are white because they remain a majority of the US population, a disproportionate share of Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and other households of color are in lower income groups due to the legacy of racist public policies and ongoing discrimination. So policies that disadvantage low-income individuals and families, like heavy reliance on sales and excise taxes, have a disproportionately negative effect on people of color. Wealthier white families who enjoy systemic advantages that have positioned them to save and build their wealth tend to pay lower sales and excise tax rates, since the portion of income set aside into savings is only taxed after a lengthy delay, if at all. I cannot end my talk without briefly addressing tax administration. Who do you audit? How are those decisions made? Thanks to ProPublica and a retired IRS economist, we know that for federal income tax purposes, the 5 counties with the highest audit rates are all predominantly African-American rural counties in the Deep South. The audit rate is also very high in South Texas's largely Hispanic counties and in counties with Native American reservations, such as in South Dakota. Primarily poor white counties, such as those in Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, also have elevated audit rates. The states with the lowest audit rates tend to be home to middle income, largely white population, places like New Hampshire, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The IRS commissioner has testified before Congress that the IRS does not discriminate on the basis of race. Yet in follow-up written questions from Senator Sherrod Brown, the IRS commissioner conceded that he had no real basis to make that claim, given the IRS does not collect data based upon race. My bottom line as I close, data, data, and more data. You cannot fully understand how tax laws are impacting people on the ground until you look at who is actually paying which taxes. Once you look, you will have a better idea of what the racially equitable next steps should include. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a tour course in politics, history, economics, and sociology, so among other things. So thank you very much, Professor. And now we'll hear from Nami Modi, who is the director of the DC Council Office of Racial Equity, where you worked since helping launch it in 2021. Prior to that, you worked in the Office of the City Administrator and the nonprofit sector before that. So we're looking forward to learning about your work at the Council Office of Racial Equity.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to speak after you also, Professor Brown. So yes, I'm the director of the Council Office of Racial Equity. We launched in 2021, so that makes us almost 2 years old. And I'll just give a little bit of background on the team so that it can kind of ground the presentation that I'll do. So we are a team of 6 incredible folks, and we spend 90% of our time on racial equity impact assessment. So like most bills that move to the council, they get a FIST, they get an LSD, and now they get a RIA, a racial equity impact assessment. And so the RIA answers the question, if this bill passes, how will it affect Black, Indigenous, and other residents of color? And so I think they're obviously 3 very different documents. And I think one of the biggest differences is sometimes ours get quite lengthy because we're looking at all of the details of the policy and how, we take it apart, we pull away from the legal jargon, and we say, okay, truly, what is this bill doing? Who do we think it's going to affect? What does that population look like from a racial perspective? What is the history that led to that? What's the trauma related to that? What is the community saying about this issue, both in the hearing, but then just generally out in the community, in the news? What do we know about what matters to the community here? What is the evidence saying? What is other jurisdictions doing? Has this been tried before? So we pull all of that together, and then we kind of make a statement about if this bill passes, we think that it will improve economic outcomes for Black residents, or we think it will exacerbate racial inequity if it's kind of a more structural bill. So that's kind of the high level of what we do. And so the process is a little bit different for every area. Obviously, the council passes such a variety of things, but it's really, there's some things that I think we have, as an office, kind of figured out are really important as values that we kind of return to again and again. And then some steps that we take that I think will have very clear threads to Dr. Brown's speech about, how to actually go about this work and assess how will a bill affect residents of color. So we've written over 100 so far. So that is, this is drawing on that kind of corpus of research. So yeah.
The next one.
Yes. Okay, so I'll kind of go through some big kind of topics, and like I said, kind of values and steps that we take that will hopefully be helpful as the tax commission does its work. So the first is that intent doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you hope policy will do or what you intend for it to do or you mean for it to do. It matters what happens, and this really requires being humble, being neutral at the outset, being curious in the research, and then learning from the research and acting on it so that the intent does match the impact at the end. And the next. And so everything is a matter of racial equity. And I think, just like Professor Brown said, it doesn't have to explicitly say race for it to matter. Obviously, something like tax policy, where it's not mentioned at all, it has huge implications and is building on a system that is, racist for race, obviously, in this country, and racism and how that has created the system that we see today. So, I hope that this is the focus of today's meeting and that it comes up again and again and again in all the conversations that this body has. So we kind of accept the premise that everything is a matter of racial equity. The next big piece is you can't know until you look. So you can't think going into it, well, where this seems really positive, we're creating accounts for people and, savings accounts or something like that. So therefore, it must have a positive racial equity impact. And in fact, if someone brings up an idea and is sure that it has a positive racial equity impact, ask them how they know that, what data are they looking at, what research have they done, because that's really critical here. Just for example, we just got a RIA today on local solar policy, which we didn't know where it was going to go when we started the research. We started digging into everything, and it was clear that there was some clear harm that was going to be done and some clear benefits, and those fall on racial lines. And so we saw that if this bill passes, it's going to increase energy burden, which is a flat fee for everybody, so it's regressive, and that would disproportionately harm folks who are Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic in the district, because their energy bills would go up, and they're paying already a higher proportion of their income towards their energy. So, like I said, you just have no idea until you really dig into things. And so speaking of research, I think the biggest thing to start with is disaggregated data. So, it obviously tells a very different story if you look at unemployment rates or for overall versus unemployment rates for Black residents versus white residents, home ownership, it's very different. So not only is it important to get kind of like that baseline from a disaggregated data level, but also to create goals based on disaggregated data by race. So, if the goal is to increase home ownership, and we don't do that with the explicit kind of goal of increasing Black home ownership, then we just increase overall home ownership, it might just actually increase the gap, right? So that's really important. And something that we actually get a lot of questions about is, well, what if you don't have DC data? And that, we're actually very lucky. I think there's a ton of data about DC, thanks to some of the folks in the room. So that's super helpful, but if it's not available, definitely looking at disaggregated data by race at the national level, but being very conscious of not doing it from a ward or income as a proxy. That's very different, and that will tell you different things. So being very explicit about race, and then talk, we speak about it, racial equity, not equity generally, or social equity, making a very conscious effort to focus on race. And so once you do have that disaggregated data, it's really important to understand like how we got here. What is the history that has led us to this point? And once you understand that history, to always state it alongside the data, because you have to contextualize it, right? These inequities are not just naturally occurring, these are deliberate choices that were made. And so we have to kind of always provide that history whenever we're talking about what the racial inequities are. And I think the other kind of piece around research is talking to the community. So not only in the forums of very formal hearing or something like that, but just what are people saying in the community, what matters to them. Kind of going with the idea that the smartest person on a topic is not in the room, and seeking their thoughts. I think the other big thing that we try to do is think about, okay, if this bill passes, how would a resident interact with it from start to finish? So how would they learn about it? What are the different kind of eligibility criteria? Who does that include or who does that exclude? What do we know about what kind of documents they're going to have at that, the moment they're interested in kind of participating in something? And then obviously looking at the research. So has this been done somewhere else? What did we learn from that? Did that research consider race? And I think one of the big things that we think about as we look at a bill is, is something being reinforced by the bill, or is the bill kind of recreating it? So if there was like, I don't know how feasible, or it's just an example, but if there was like an incentive for walking to work, well, then the questions would be, well, like who, is living near their work, or who has an employer near them, or who works during the day, right? And how do those things interact, right? So those are real questions that we would start to ask. And, if that was a policy, would privilege advance privilege in that case? And is that the goal? And the last thing I'll just say is a little bit different, but I think one of the things that we think about a lot is that we're like, our team is joining this very long fight that has gotten us to this point, and it's going to be a very long fight after us to see the racial equity that we want to see. And I think one of the things that we've learned, and we, as a team kind of think about a lot, is like sometimes it's hard to be the first voice in the room to say something, but that's good. And the goal is for them to start that conversation. That's kind of what we hope to do with Frias, is to really start that conversation. That maybe you're the first, but you're not the only at the end. So I'm looking forward to seeing this sort of be a leader in the space. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much. You've certainly accomplished a lot in just what, a year and a half, you said, since.
Yeah,
you're off the
almost
ground?
2 years.
Almost 2 years. That's excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, commission members, what questions do we have for our great speakers tonight? Yes,
Thank you, Gregory. Professor Brown, it was really interesting listening to you. Thank you for being here with us. My first question is on the data collection side. To me, it seems the difference between presenting information about your race if you're going to a hospital and getting services. There's something completely different about giving up your data to the IRS. How do you think that can be solved? Because I can see communities of color actually being much more reluctant to reveal information, especially given the history.
Oh, and I've gone on record as saying we should not change the 1040 to have a race box. No, right? So as we see, the IRS is somehow managing to target Black people without the race box. So I can only imagine what would happen if it was. So no, there should be no race boxes. But there is more than one way to get race and tax data. One way is imputation. You impute the data by first and last name and zip code, because we live in a racially segregated country. So that's one way. But the best way, not the best way, another way would be for Treasury to talk to the Census Bureau. Census Bureau has, tracked. So you were talking about disaggregating data. We can, so what you do is have the government talk to the federal government talk to other parts of the federal government. You don't need a box. You don't need any legislation. You just need political will to get it done. But thank you for raising that question, because I am completely opposed to a race box on tax forms.
I have other questions I can ask.
Go ahead, please.
Um, you talked a lot about how the federal government's policies contribute to the wealth gap. A lot of state and local governments, well, state governments, we conform to the federal definitions of income. And that's mostly for enforcement purposes. It makes life easier. We decouple from time to time. But for example, a good example is the mortgage interest deduction. We can think as DC as eliminating it to help with racial wealth gap, but that will also make the district far less attractive when it comes to home purchases. So we have to sort of like live in this competitive world, especially being in a metro area that's so administratively fractured. I was curious, what are your thoughts on what state and local governments can do, especially in the context of income taxes or other, in the context of income taxes, what power do we have?
So one thing I'll say is ever since the 2017 Tax Act, fewer and fewer Americans take advantage of the mortgage introduction. It is less significant today than at any point in history. And I foresee it going away eventually. I foresee it being repealed because when the mortgage introduction was minimized by capping home prices that are home mortgages that are eligible for to $750,000. I don't know if the real estate lobby pushed back, but nobody heard them. So that's been a really powerful lobby for keeping the mortgage introduction. And it's like, who are they? What are they doing? We haven't heard. So, less than 1 in 5 taxpayers take advantage of the mortgage introduction. So I'm going to say, nah, don't give up on repeal, on the potential of repealing it yet, because I don't think it matters as much with the increase in the standard deduction, right? So if you're following the federal, then you deal with the standard deduction. I deal with the standard deduction. For me, when I think about state and local, I think about the other taxes, not income taxes, but property taxes. What are you doing in your assessments? What are you doing in your appeal process? This is where the research shows Black homeowners are getting disadvantaged. So what are you doing, with appraisals? What are you doing with all aspects of home buying? When I think about something else, most Americans have their wealth from their homes. It's true for Black Americans, it's true for all Americans. Black homeowners, even though they have less wealth than white homeowners, have significantly more wealth than renters. So one way a state and local government could think about encouraging homeownership would be to find sources of revenue for down payment assistance, because that's a huge bar. It isn't giving a first-time home buyer tax credit because I can't buy a home. I can't get the credit, right? I need some money to help me buy the home and then qualify for the credit. So, thinking of down payment assistance, thinking of, when we talk about gentrification, thinking of a fund that would enable long-term residents to stay in their neighborhood and pay the increased property tax that's gonna go up from the gentrifying, neighbors that are moving in. So thinking of ways to keep existing homeowners in their homes when the property tax bill goes so high that they can't afford to pay it and have to afford to sell their property. So, sales taxes, how much of your budget is due to fees and fines, which tend to disproportionately be paid by Black and Brown taxpayers. So it's the whole, and I used to teach a course in state and local finance, so you're like bringing me back. Okay, it's the whole source of your revenue stream. It isn't just income, and we're talking about localities; they can't even have an income tax, so it's property tax mainly. So it's looking at how your other non-income tax systems are functioning and whether they're functioning fairly.
Professor, you mentioned about how regressive basically the sales and excise taxes are. So I don't know how familiar you are with our tax policies here.
Not that.
In the city, but We, in the last few years, we have taxed where we didn't before, a lot of services like health club memberships and dry cleaning and that sort of stuff. I think female health products and diapers are now exempt. Food has been exempt for a long time. So short of reducing the rate altogether, are there other obvious areas without getting rid of the whole tax together that a tax system can be more progressive, or sales tax?
Yeah, I mean, you're basically answering the question, right? So what you do, it's regressive because low-income Americans pay a higher percentage. So you ask, what do low-income Americans pay their, pay sales taxes on? People pay, what do low-income people, pay most of their money on? They pay it on housing, they pay it on food, they pay it on gas, right? So if you are talking about helping that group, then you target your sales tax relief to the things they're spending money on. It sounds like you're doing a
Some of
lot
that
of
at
that,
least,
but
yeah,
it sounds like perhaps there could be more. But if the given is we have to have a sales tax, how do we make it more equitable? You could, like you said, you're starting to tax things that hadn't been taxed before, and you're looking at high income, basically what higher income Americans spend their money on, right? So we could have country clubs, we could, so you could think about luxury cars, you could think about, other things that high income Americans pay their, spend their money on, and therefore if they pay more in taxes, others can pay less.
So, in the meantime, I'm uniquely interested in what you said about agency and voice and the community experiencing these policies. Because I think for me, one of the things that's really important, especially in the seat that I sit in, is to really get a community voice, the neighbor's voice, on policy that will impact, on policies that will impact them. And I think as I sit around the table and I think about the tables that I sit around during a regular week and day, the people that are at those tables who are the neighbors in the community we're serving, they have no clue about how this actually impacts them. And so I guess question that when I say no clue, I'm not saying I'm not using that, everyone has no clue. But most of them can't articulate necessarily what you just articulated about experiencing tax policy and being able to articulate to their friends how they're living and experiencing that too. So as I sit around the table with them, what are some of the things that I can do to help create some level of, I don't know if it's homogeneous language, I don't know if it's a communication method, I don't, what to ensure that there's a level playing field for conversation so that I can actually learn from them to bring back to this table what's meaningful.
Yeah.
That's important for me.
Yeah, no, and I think that's something we think about a lot, especially like if you think about like the structure of the council which we operate in, and if someone wants to give formal feedback on a policy, you have to know when the policy is being marked up. You have to read through the legal language. You have to sign up for the hearing. You have to be available at that time. You have to be available at the time slot that it's coming. And so I think it's the structure that we've created that's very inaccessible. That's something I think about a lot. Is like everyone has their areas of expertise, and they all have their own like jargon and things like that. So that is so true of law too, of this policy world that we live in. And so one of the things that we do is like if we're writing about policy, we start with a glossary, or we just try to avoid the jargon altogether, and we just say what it is. So instead of this will if we'll avoid acronyms if we can, we'll spell it out. We'll just be very conscious of like, okay, what's kind of like insider baseball. And so we'll start there so that everyone has, this is what the bill is doing in plain language, this is what the current law is in plain language, so that whatever expertise you come to the table with, you can, engage in this topic. And then I think it's really I think also providing, going to where people are, which is like a little different than like when when you're at the table. But I think going to people where they're naturally going to go anyway, not saying, hey, I want to have this conversation about tax with you, right? But like, you know, okay, are people at the grocery store on Sundays? Like, okay, you know, what are they, like, what's top of the mind for them at that point? And if there's a specific question, I think that's really helpful, right? There's so much that someone could say about taxes, you know, are impacting their lives. And I think it's even about the way that people have to go about filing their taxes, right? It's like, how do you, like, you know, do you have to go to a TurboTax? And then how much are you giving away of your credit? And, you know, what kinds of, how are you treated there? Or, you know, do you feel like empowered to ask questions, and why or why not? And so I think like really zeroing in on like specific things really helps. Just generally, I think anyone, if you're asking for feedback, right, you're just like, okay, what do you want to know? And then kind of making sure that there isn't any feeling of you know, jargon or something that's like you have to be in the know to engage. So
I also think when people hear taxes, fear and loathing is what comes up,
Yes.
right? You literally would have to like chase somebody down the street to
Yes.
say, I want to talk to you about taxes.
Agreed.
And the only moment we get people's attention is like in April,
Yes.
right?
Right.
You know, so the woman who writes about race and tax is like,
That's right.
when can I get an op-ed on taxes published? Like in April, okay? So part of it is confronting the fear and loathing and helping people understand it's a year-long thing and it's really important and you're getting disadvantaged. So let me tell, so it's a storytelling thing.
Yes.
And those of us in the tax policy world are generally not very good
Yeah.
at telling that story. It's got to be a heart thing, not a head thing. We're like, well, there are 3 things wrong with the, like, okay, you've lost me, right? So you have to talk about, or you not have to, but one way to do it is talk about fairness. Do you think it's fair that the richest Americans don't pay their taxes? You know, the story you could start with is the ProPublica series on the wealthy billionaires. And we know what their tax rate is, and their tax rate is lower than the Amazon worker. Okay, that's an entree into a conversation. So it's about storytelling in a way that gets their attention and helps them see being engaged in this could help you hold government accountable so that the tax system looks different and better for you going forward. And people just don't, you know, make that case.
Yeah.
Just
That's good.
We should note that Commission Member Dr. Carolyn Rudd has joined us, and she's online. So I want to give Carolyn an opportunity to pose any questions that she'd like.
I don't have a question at this time, but I'm glad you noted that I have joined virtually.
I have a question, if you know me. So how do you relate to, say, the Office of Revenue Analysis doing a fiscal impact statement? And for example, something that's not so obvious, when a tax break is given to a nonprofit or a real estate entity or some type of a tax incentive is given, do you assess how much of the wealth associated with that tax break or that organization or that property is black or white or another person of color?
yeah, so we do areas on like tax abatements and tax exemptions. If that's what you're
Yes.
getting at, yeah. So we kind of look at it more from like what's the, like, who does that organization serve, or thinking about like if there's like a land disposition or something like that. You know, all right, they're creating affordable housing on this district land. So what is the district getting in return? And is that, do we think, equivalent to what is being given by the district? So, you know, if it's looking at affordable housing and, you know, this land decision is going to create 180 units of housing in this area, and only 10 of them are affordable. It's like a 99-year lease for $1, and 10 are affordable. Well, who's going to benefit from that? And then if it's more affordable units, well, what rates are they affordable at? So, and looking at the median buy rates in the district, who do we think can actually afford those units? So it's kind of more from like a benefit perspective typically, but it really kind of depends on the specific thing.
So it's more of who is the beneficiary of the organization rather than the wealth of the organization itself or its composition or its investors or.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of a situation where we've had something like that, but the ones that are coming to mind are like Walt Whitman for like the health, the hospital, and things like that, where it's kind of like a nonprofit for the
Yes.
benefit of an entity, although there's certainly LLCs.
I have a question on the refundable wealth tax credit. One is what cities or states or jurisdictions have started it, and is it kind of akin to we talked about the reparations book you're writing earlier. Is that kind of a baby step towards something grander like that, or do you see those separate?
So it's interesting. So the easy answer is nobody. No state has done it yet. I proposed it in my book. I did a presentation for a conference for the Federal Reserve, and the president of the St. Louis branch liked the idea, but no state has taken it. And my wealth tax proposal was my second best proposal. My first proposal was a reparations tax credit designed to compensate Black Americans who had paid higher taxes. But that would be struck down as unconstitutional the second it was enacted. So I went to my second best choice, which is the wealth tax credit. So, but when I think about reparations, the wealth tax credit doesn't address reparations because it's about compensating Black Americans for things that have happened to them because of race. The wealth tax credit would apply to everybody. So it is in the, given the constitutional constraints, a second best option. And I thought a pretty good one, given that 83% of Black households have less wealth than the median, income. So they would be eligible for it disproportionately. But no one has, but people have been, when I talk about it, people have been interested in it. It's been well received.
It strikes me, given the small size of the district and our ability to know where our people are, and we have less data, we have fewer people, right? That if we were to start anywhere, starting it in a small space like this would be
Could make
particularly
a lot of-
opportune.
Yeah, could make a lot of sense.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Please.
So given that the federal government has no interest in it, the place like the district would have to collect data on wealth. How do we go about doing that?
I would say, so for example, how does the Federal Reserve collect data on wealth? They look at the Survey of Consumer Finances. And I don't know whether you'd be able to get Survey of Consumer Finance data for the District of Columbia. But if you could, that would be an easy first step because it's already being collected. You're like, no, we can't get it. I'm just saying if you could, right? Okay, so we can't. So, for example, you have property assessment data. That's a level of wealth data. So whenever people say to me, oh, I can't collect wealth data, what are you talking about? I'm like, we have property taxes. That is a wealth tax. And no one ever says, oh, we can't do that, right? So it's a matter of like, let's calm down. So you have some wealth data. And if you were to look at the information that you collect, you might have more of this than you think. If you have a property tax on cars or things like that, right? So my suggestion would be to look, you might have some thoughts, would be to look at the data you already collect, because you may have more of it than you think.
This is Carolyn Ward. I do have a question for the professor. I can't wait to read your book, The Whiteness of Wealth. You talked about chapter 6. What do you think is the most compelling aspect of that chapter that we might want to look at as it relates to the work of the Tax Revision Commission?
I would say you're already doing a great job with collecting data and analyzing proposals. I think you are light years ahead of any other municipality that I've spoken to. And you're to be commended for that. The wealth tax credit is the one I can think of. In the chapter, I also give strategies for Black Americans, given they're in a system of wealth building for white Americans, right? So I talk about if you're going to buy a home, recognize, be intentional about it. Recognize that if you are the only Black person in an all-white neighborhood, the home's going to be a good financial investment. Your neighbor may call the cops on you. Your kids may be targeted in school, but it's a good financial investment. On the other hand, if you buy a home in a racially diverse or all-Black neighborhood, it's not as good a financial investment. So make sure you are not house poor. Make sure in that situation, you don't put all of your money into your home. You don't ever take out a home equity line of credit because you don't know what the appreciation is going to do. So I talk about, you know, if you are working for an employer that has a retirement account, do your best to contribute, even if it's a small amount. So the chapter also talks about defensive strategies, but in terms of offense, one of my big ones is data collection, which you're doing a great job of, right? So that's, you know, step one, you got to see the data to know what's going on. I hope that was responsive.
Yes, thank you very much.
Dr. Brown, with your wealth tax credit proposal, are you also proposing like a way to raise revenue to pay for that? Would you do like a wealth tax to offer a wealth tax credit?
So in the book, in various chapters, my overall proposal is to get rid of the gift, inheritance gift exclusion, get rid of most of the exclusion, most of the deductions, which would actually enable us to lower tax rates and still raise a ton of money. So my overall proposal is to have everyone have a living allowance, which is tied to what it would take in your community to thrive. That's the amount of income you can make and not pay taxes. Anything over that, you pay taxes. So I have a structure or tax system that would raise revenue, but I also have various suggestions in other chapters. So for example, my college chapter, I suggest an excise tax on 501c3 university endowments to the extent they exceed $750 million, right? So and for that, I suggested raising revenue that way to increase Pell Grants, because Pell Grants have not kept up with inflation, to put it politely. They haven't kept up from the late 70s. So, you know, I have different proposals to increase taxes for certain things, but if my ideal tax system were adopted, there'd be extra revenue to pay for lots of things. This is, you know, when I talk about taxing endowments of more than $750,000, this is when I'm glad I'm tenured.
We've spoken a lot at previous meetings about a desire to incentivize entrepreneurship, especially among small businesses, businesses owned by people of color. What experience have you had with taxes and equity issues that can propel us there?
Well, the key to that is access to capital. I mean, one of the things Black and brown entrepreneurs are always talking about is they don't get invited to the tables where lots of capital is being invested. So it's getting them connected with angel investors, getting them connected with people who have the money, and that's difficult. That's difficult, to put it politely, but it's a function of access to capital. You can think about how you award contracts. You can think about, you know, I know DC has a rich history of this, just like Atlanta has a rich history, right? There are, you know, historically there have been Black elected officials in DC that made sure that happened, just like in Atlanta, made sure that happened. So you can make sure that that's functioning as fully as possible, that make sure every part of the District of Columbia government is being inclusive when they talk about procurement and contracts that they're awarding, things like that, and making sure that they're including small business, minority-owned businesses in those that they're awarding contracts to.
You've probably read all the books, right? Okay.
I mean, I'm just thinking about this, what you said about privilege advancing privilege and to, are you also assessing where disadvantage, like, sort of both sides of the coin?
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking of examples at this point. But yeah, I think it's looking at always starting with like baseline, who is being impacted, what are the relevant data points, you know, how do those correlate with race, and then kind of extrapolating out what to do. The best data that we have and the time that we have. So, but yeah, absolutely.
And there generally tend to be tax winners and tax losers. So if there, and this is something I learned early on, the first thing I ever wrote was about the marriage bonus penalty. I didn't talk about marriage because I know you guys do something very innovative in DC with respect to marriage and trying to work around the marriage penalty problem by allowing individual filing. But what was it about my parents? Why were they paying so much in taxes? It was the marriage penalty because my mother and father made almost identical amounts of income. And that's the household that gets disadvantaged. But when I first started talking about it, I was just talking about the marriage penalty. And another professor said, Dorothy, you have to talk about the marriage bonus. You can't talk about the marriage penalty. It's like, oh, so there was a light bulb going forward. Whenever I was looking at a tax revision, I said, okay, there's a winner. There's got to be a loser. I've got to look for the loser. Where's the loser? The winner in home sales is if you sell at a gain. The loser is if you sell at a loss and it's not deductible. So we don't allow losses on home sales, but we allow losses on capital gains. Like really? So, we know who's losing money on capital gains versus who's losing money on homes. And those are completely different categories of people. So there's always this yin and yang. There's always this, somebody's winning, somebody's losing. And the tax law has that built in. And it's who doesn't qualify for that benefit is the person who's losing.
I think actually now I think about it, the vehicle excise tax that was in the RIA that we shared for today's session, the incentive was to have people buy cars that have better gas mileage or electric or all those good things, but those are more expensive. So who can buy those cars, and then who's going to pay less of an excise tax, and who's already paying more of their, more of their tax portion. And there we go, disadvantage.
In terms of tax data policy and disaggregating among races, I wonder if there are any lessons to be learned from like 20 years ago when No Child Left Behind first started and the government was first serious about tracking test scores among races, and whether or not you supported the law to begin with. Nevertheless, they started to do it and they got better over time. Is any of that lesson applicable to what we might start now in terms of tax and income data?
I definitely think, for the Treasury to start doing it, there's going to be some growing pains and it'll get better over time. But the key is to start, right? Start doing it and it will get better. And, there's quantitative and there's qualitative data. And I think they go hand in hand. So it's one thing to have a chart that has all these numbers, but there's a story to tell about the numbers that contextualize the numbers that make a lot of sense. So I think it's important. It's like the sociologists and the economists need to talk, right? They don't, but magic happens when they do. And I think it's about telling, qualitative interview-based or qualitative storytelling really puts the meat on the bones to data. And it actually is what can reach people. Those stories, not a chart, but those stories is what can engage the general public.
So the last time we were together, we had a presentation from three people that did a fabulous job, and Santiago Pinto from the Federal Reserve Bank mentioned an opportunity for us to look at, and it was this general sales tax, and DC compared to the rest of the country could look at that. There was some opportunity for us to grow tax revenue there. I guess I'm hearing I'm juxtaposing that conversation with the conversation about racial equity and what to tax, right? So that the folks, so it's not regressive. Right. And I guess my question is, are there examples around the country where general sales tax has taken on a racial equity lens that's working? That is, it could be a model for us to follow or an index for us to reflect on, or people have started to think about it in that way. I'm just curious.
So the easier answer is, I don't know. I know people are starting to think about it, but nothing has come to my attention that this is what they're actually doing.
Commission members, anything more for our speakers? Questions? No? Well, thank you both very much. Those are really compelling and provocative presentations, and no doubt we're going to chew on that for a long time. So thank you both very much. for that.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Like now, we're going to try a new thing, which is to, while it's fresh in our minds, kind of reflect on what we heard today. Say what we think might be the implications for our work in the year ahead. If there are any areas where we think we kind of want to know more or do more, and Nick and Mike would begin to chew on that for the year with us. So are there anything jump out about where we go with this or where it might lead us in the months ahead?
I'd love to see us maybe look at a wealth tax.
I'm sorry, Erica, would you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
I said, I think it'd be great to look at her wealth tax credit proposal, Dr. Brown's
Okay.
wealth tax credit proposal, and see
Thanks.
how that map onto the district.
I think it will also be useful if we get some feedback from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer on the administration of taxes like this. It seems like it'll be a totally new thing.
Yes. So we're happy to do that. It is oftentimes hard to implement what the good concept is, just based on what authority you have to actually collect the right information from folks and whatnot. I implemented a few taxes in my career, and we never end up where the electeds originally wanted to be because of some sort of limitation. I think the district has more flexibility than any other jurisdiction for obvious reasons. But happy to do that. That's, consider that assessment one, and we'll do it.
And perhaps you could also notate what the restrictions are and what it would take to modify them or remove them.
Yes,
Yeah.
of course, of course.
It'll be interesting to know also approximately how much house values account for overall wealth. And if there's a large variation across different types of households. I know that we don't have a whole lot of measures of wealth, but we have capital gains data and things like that from tax returns. Because then we can say, okay, forget about the rest of the wealth. Let's do something around housing values.
Yeah, I think the data question broadly is something to look into too. It's not exactly tax policy, but are there ways that we can start to work toward our collection?
David, you've been quiet tonight.
I'm just listening, just
Our
listening.
collection of data by race and ethnicity or some way to leverage census data.
Sure.
I mean, we have some organizations around that are doing that, right?
Always the tough part, certainly in property tax, is to understand how to deal with, I'll use this loosely or actually very specifically, publicly owned facilities, not like government, but rather owned by a real estate investment trust or something like that. How do you begin to sort out these kinds of questions? And it's not a reason to not try, but you end up with a big group of wealth that it's hard to then assign back to where it's owned. And so you're always looking at a smaller set. And to some extent, transaction taxes are the same because many transactions are business to business. If they're all owned by a local owner who's in the district, that's easy to sort out, not easy, but possible. Whereas any publicly held firm, there's not a chance. How do you assign taxes paid for transactions by a publicly held firm? How do you make sense of that? again, no reason not to try, but you end up with those kind of blocks right off.
Other thing that occurs to me that might be helpful, one of the research that Professor Brown mentioned was assessed values of homes in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black. When that research came out, we actually did an analysis at the DC Post Center looking at your reports on sales to assessment ratios. We actually found that in neighborhoods where a large share of the population are Black residents, the assessments are actually below the sales price, which is the opposite of what our research found. But I don't know what to make of that finding either, because maybe the houses should have been valued more. I mean, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on sort of how to approach that particular question. And we have CAMA, you know, it's large machines, especially for residential.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, we just, the Office of Inspector General just published a
Yeah,
report on this particular point. And, you know, I don't know right now. There's many thoughts that we're trying to sort out with that assessment. And for all of you, I guess it's every 3 years, I think, the Office of Inspector General has to evaluate how we assess properties or a time period. I'm not sure, it's 3 years. And so while their focus was generally commercial, it did lead to interesting questions about, as I was going through it, they just looked at ward, I believe, or subsections of wards rather than a more serious look at socioeconomic issues that we're talking about here, and how to look at what those ratios look like in that, from that lens.
And the interesting thing about that report was they were trying to get at this very difficult question of cap rates.
Yeah.
And they were using sales data from pre-pandemic period, which was very shocking to me. But anyways.
No comment.
Okay.
So getting to what Shauna said also about sales tax and regressivity. So Professor Brown cited, for example, then you don't tax things that lower income people use more. And she actually said gas. And it strikes me though is cars are in some effect a expression of affluence too. And then you have people here in the city who don't live here, and people who do live here can buy gas in a different jurisdiction if they're near the border or something. So like what if we had a goal of, and I saw in one of the charts you had that higher income people spend like 2.8% of their income on sales taxes, lower income people is closer to 4%. If we had a goal of getting lower income people down to 2.8, say, what are the elements that we tax that could do that? And is it possible to do it in such a way that we didn't reduce everybody by the same amount, of course? Or have we pretty much over time got to that point through all the measures the council's done in the last 20 years?
You know, this may 10% of our revenue is contributed by 50% of the population. So half of the people in the city pay 10% of the freight of running the city. Schools, bridges, police departments, first responders, Medicaid, the whole thing. You have a quarter of the people who pay 75% of the freight of the city. So half of the people pay 10% and a quarter pay 25%. Is it the policy of, is it what we want to have, you know, half of the people ultimately pay nothing? I don't think so, because I don't think we value those things that are free. We don't take care of them, we don't appreciate them, we don't use those resources wisely or scarcely. I think we want, personally, what I want is I want us to have a progressive system, but one in which everyone has a contribution that they are making to the whole community. That's the purpose of a community. When we relegate half of the city essentially to a de minimis payment, that's not, that may not be de minimis to them individually, it may be quite a significant contribution. But in terms of running the whole community, if we don't have folks essentially pulling part of the wagon, I think it then reflects on how we view the wagon. And I, for one, am a believer that we all have a part to play in pulling the wagon. It should be a progressive one, but I don't want to be included in the group that says we should essentially, and I don't think that the half of the population that currently is in that mix, I don't think they want to contribute nothing either. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is ultimately a city, a community, a family that decides how we allocate resources and how we pay for things like schools. We want to talk about issues of equity. I'm going to put a giant elephant in the room. So I'm a member of a community that, that where we are taxed for any number of things that we don't use at all. They're called schools, right? We talk about the issue of how race plays a part of inequity. Look for a moment at the LGBT community, the taxes that are paid, and the benefits that we get for those. You talk about, until very recently, we couldn't marry. We didn't have the luxury of a marriage penalty or a marriage tax. You all are having conversations that don't even apply to us at all. So, there's a lot to go around. Ultimately, I want to see a city where we are all part of the family, where we contribute in a progressive way what we can, but we don't look at our neighbors as somehow responsible for squaring all accounts. That might be a little dramatic, but where we look at each other as all working towards the same thing. So when you say, should we pay nothing in sales tax? Well, I mean, ultimately, Judas, we've got to have some taxes. These schools aren't funding themselves. Medicaid ain't paying for itself. The police aren't paying for themselves. And if we ultimately squeeze the 25% that pays the 75% of the freight, you squeeze them too hard, and where do they go? Do they all move? No. Do they make choices to maybe relocate to their other home in a non-tax, zero tax jurisdiction? Maybe. But is it the message that we are sending? That's the last I'll say. Policy is about sending messages. And what messages do we want to send?
Anything else or observation? So I guess it's just enough, more than enough, things to put on your to-do list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, I know we have a tax competitiveness session coming up. And it does say in there sort of preferences, exemptions, but it would be great if, and I don't know if you already have planned to do that, but if the sort of racial equity conversation can come back into that. So when we're talking about those exemptions, questions that just given by NAMI and by Dr. Brown session. Maybe we can prep the panelists or the speakers to try.
Yeah, I mean, I
bring that in.
feel like one of the lessons this conversation is then to bring to circle back around to the racial equity conversation in all these panels. I will say that's as I look at that session, I'm feeling like the session has a lot of questions in it and a lot of issues, and one meeting may not be enough to dig into everything. There, but we should, think about exactly how to do that.
Gregory, I have a question. When we look at benefits about the long-term nature versus the short-term nature. Are we trying to have an immediate benefit or a long-term benefit for a particular community? And so I think that's something to, when we talk about, our CBE program, which we all support. If there is a requirement for a CBE program and there isn't a vendor that is necessarily available, and so you can't purchase the items that are necessary to be purchased, that community that is ultimately burdened doesn't get the benefit of those items because they're not. And I'll use an example that's not perfect. It's not intended to be race, but I remember when I chaired the health committee, we couldn't buy syphilis testing. We couldn't buy syphilis tests. There was no minority vendor that could supply them. Right. And so, so you ask yourself the question is it better that we not test for syphilis as a condition for not being able to find the CBE and the public health implications there. There was a recent discussion, I don't know if it came to you on, and this is a promise to be brief, on the issue of project labor agreements, which everyone seems to love. The issue with project labor agreements, in my view, however, is that they perpetrate wage theft, because people are required to join unions and make contributions to pensions they will never get. And the studies suggest that there's a 19% penalty for people. If you force them into unions and pay contributions, they will never get those benefits. That is a form of wage theft. So do we think that that's the other issue is that you've got in many unions, you've got a legacy of racism. There aren't typically many, and you know this from your work, many of our contractors aren't minority. So by virtue of requiring them to be a laborer, you automatically exclude Black businesses. So this gets very complicated very fast. And so I'm just curious, when we're looking at this lens, are we looking at what it means today? Are we trying to square accounts today? Or are we looking at what it means long-term? Maybe that's not an interesting question, but it's one that I find interesting.
Yeah, I mean, long term, right? We're looking at gaps and inequities that we know are going to take
I think it's complex is my point.
generation to fix. So long term.
My point is it's complex. There's lots of sides to these things. And what I don't want us to do is to get lost in simplicity and think lost in simplicity, we square accounts and move on. These are complicated questions that we're trying to make. I would like to see a family full of opportunity for all of us in the city, and a system that allows that to flourish for everyone.
As I understand it, eventually some of these ideas are going to graduate to that list that you've given us, right? And then eventually that list will either grow or shrink as we get closer to drafting time and come up with actual recommendations. But I guess the purpose here is we can all feel assured that once it makes the list, it's not forgotten. So even if we don't talk about it for 6 or 7 meetings, it doesn't mean it's off the radar, and we'll come back to it when you start drafting drafts in months, right?
I would also say, if you notice something that's not making it onto that list, feel free to say, hey, forgot about this.
Well, I think we're on the verge of finishing early tonight, unless anybody has any business or.
My son's in a car accident, so that's why.
Sorry, what?
Is he okay?
He's okay. I'll kill him.
Was it his fault?
Yeah, it was his fault.
We all have accidents.
Okay, so I guess we are adjourned until January.
So January 3rd.
We'll be here.
So happy holidays, everybody.
Yes, happy holiday to you all.
Carol, happy.
Nice seeing you.
Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Caroline.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.